I want to read just the beginning of the book because I would like to talk tonight and get Jules to talk tonight more about the work that you have never seen before that's in the book. Works that started when he was about 4 years old. Oh, sorry, you can't hear me? Work that... No, okay, fine, I was over here. I want to read the beginning, which is of the book, because just a little bit, because I want to get Jules to talk tonight about the work that no one has ever seen before that's in our book. He started working when he was 4, and his mother saved a huge amount of it, so you actually see, not tonight, but in the book, some of his earliest work. Now I have to move this, I see. Jules Feiffer was born in the Bronx on the eve of the Great Depression. Twin misfortunes of location and timing, in Feiffer's judgment, except for the fact that the late 1920s and early 1930s were also the golden age of comics. Little Orphan Annie and Wash Tubbs were not quite 5 when Jules emerged on January 26, 1929, the same month as Tarzan of the Apes, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, and Popeye the Sailor. Mickey Mouse debuted as a syndicated strip in 1930, Dick Tracy in 1931, Terry and the Pirates and Lil Abner in 1934, Superman in 1938, and Will Eisner's The Spirit in 1940, one of Jules's most favorite writers. Collectively, the funny papers and their siblings, comic books, would serve as Jules' creative muse, his private tutor, his one reliable ally from childhood through adolescence. Comics provided him emotional and intellectual succor in the short term. In the long run, he was counting on them to provide him a way out. In dozens of interviews over the years and in his memoir, Backing Into Forward, Feiffer describes himself, in essence, as a changeling, a child assigned by mischievous fate to the wrong parents, the wrong borough, the wrong life. A captive innocent whose intended destiny would have to be heroically earned. Growing up in an atmosphere of economic gloom, Jules's words, weighed down by a pervasive feeling of powerlessness, and equally beset by anxiety and resentment, the changeling sensed the possibility of rescue in the arts. All the pleasure in my life came from movies, radio, cartoon strips, and the comics. So did much of his education. What books borrowed from enlightened neighbors did for young Abe Lincoln in the Kentucky wilderness, Depression-era movies, radio, and comics did for young Jules Feiffer. The formative influences of his childhood were filtered through double features at the Ward Theater on Westchester Avenue across from the L, 3 blocks from home. Gangster films starring James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart, musicals where he fell in love with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, Donald O'Connor and Busby Berkeley. At home, Jules listened to radio around the clock. The Adventures of Superman, I Love a Mystery, Fibber McGee and Molly, Fred Allen, Jack Benny, Don Winslow of the Navy, and Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Feiffer taught himself to read, crouched over the Sunday papers, spread out on the floor of his bedroom. It was like looking at dancing wallpaper, he says. A page full of Cagneys, fighting, strutting, stamping, gesticulating. The colors were vibrant, the settings exotic, menacing or absurd. The language at once formulaic and transporting. I was trying to draw myself out of the world I was living in, into the one I wanted to live in. It was not a career choice, it was a survival choice. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I wanted to read this for a reason, many reasons. Jules talks so often about, the title of his memoir is Backing Into Forward. And he talks about it as one big accident and stumbling from one art form to another, trying to figure out what he was doing. But in fact, I think that there's another part of the story. A story of huge drive, talent from the beginning, not all the talents at his disposal that he thought he needed, but a continuum. And it really did start with pictures that he was drawing at 4. So from then on, I want to ask Jules a few questions. Do you remember, can you tell us a little bit about Comics Caravan?
I guess the first comic books came out in about 1935 or 1936. They were reprints of newspaper strips. and newspaper strips of which I was an addict. And some of them had one color or two colors added so that they were not black and white the way the strips were in the newspapers. They were also much smaller than the newspapers, but they had some of my favorites. But after a while, they began to use original characters, slightly bigger, and very badly drawn, because the artists they got were just young would-bes and wannabes, some of whom had talent but hadn't been developed yet, and were learning the craft, and they weren't that much older than me. But this was, and I guess it was like kids in the 60s or late 50s listening to early rock and roll and thinking, as they heard this music, which was still inexpert and crude, well, Jesus, I can do that. That's not much better than I am. And generations of eventually brilliant musicians were motivated because they thought they could get into something which doesn't seem that challenging. They could learn it. And that's what I felt about comics, that I couldn't imagine myself as a painter, and I wasn't interested in painting. I wasn't interested in watercolors or oils or, I loved words and pictures. I think Martha talks about this in the book, that I had trouble learning how to read. But my love for comics, and I'm not alone in this, my love for comics taught me how to read because I wanted to know what these pictures were saying. And I've heard others say that over the years, that this was a prod to literacy. And this form that was considered low grade and junk, and but I adored it. What was your question? And who are you?
I was going to follow with a different question, but you introduced something we'll talk about later, which is the book that Jules did on comics and his own interpretation.
Comics Caravan.
Yes, but I wanted you to talk about your own first comic strip, Comics Caravan, which you peddled in the streets of the Bronx.
I don't remember.
Your sister peddled them.
Yes, but Comics Caravan was a comic book that I created because there were comics out there that I wanted to emulate. And so I started with my own 64-page comic book. 60 comics were then a dime, and there were 64 pages. And they were dated always 3 or 4 months in advance. So in January, you'd get the April issue, and or the May issue, or say summer, and none of this made sense to me. But I tried to date my comics ahead of the professional comics. So the only way I could ever get the drop on them is beating them out on dating. And if there was Superman, I created Ultraman, and if there was Slam Bradley, I had Gunnar Dixon. I just took the early original comic strips, swiped newspaper strips. They swiped these great, brilliant, and original newspaper cartoonists like Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon, and Milton Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates. And they swiped the characters, and they gave them equivalent names. And so I did the same thing. The other thing that was a very important part of the superhero or the neo-superhero was that all of the strip artists in the comic strip that began in 1890, particularly in the New York World and the Hearst Press, these cartoonists mostly were Irish immigrants, or sons of Irish immigrants, and WASPs, and a few Jews, a sprinkling of Jews, but it was not dominated by Jews. The comic book was a New York scene, and by the 1930s, the kids whose parents had come over in the early 1900s, as mine had, these boys had gotten to be 16 and 17, and the ones who were drawing were going to music and art high school, and they began drawing comics. It was their way of getting out of the depression world of their parents. I mean, everything was about getting out. Everything was about finding a way out of this economic malaise in which people could not find jobs and were on the streets. And instead of feeling that this is a national disease, as my mother thought it was my father's failure, that there was no such thing as a real depression, he wasn't trying hard enough. And that was part of the ethic. The Jewish boys who became cartoonists wanted to become illustrators. Nobody wanted, they wanted to be above their station, but they also wanted to be above their station as Jews. And so instead of writing about Jewish heroes, Superman was not Seymour Goldberg, he was Clark Kent. And then there was Sandman, and then there was the real identities. Batman was not Bobo Schwartz, he was Bruce Wayne, and from Bob Kane, who was really Khan. So all of these heroes were named Wesley, and Bruce, and Clark, and Will Eisner, who did The Spirit. The Spirit's real identity, when he was a detective, was Denny Colt, an Irish kid. And when Eisner started doing his graphic comics many years later, and in a sense started this field and made popular, and was one of the first to make this field popular, when he worked in the Depression genre and he stopped working in the super or mystery genre, but when he did personal strips, personal in terms of himself and his career, and he did Benighted Jews on the streets of New York, and boy were they benighted, and boy were those streets worn down and miserable. And then Eisner drew himself, in his confessional comic books, and he looked like Denny Colt. He still couldn't do himself as a Jew, even though the material was Jewish. Getting over that need to not be me as much as you try to be me, but to assimilate, to be one of them. And that was the whole thing behind Superman. That Superman's creation was, that Siegel and Schuster with these two Jewish boys from Cleveland, at the height of anti-Semitism in the Midwest, Father Coughlin, rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and Bunds, Nazi Bunds, and German Bunds all over the Midwest, groups of called the Black Legion, and all sorts of anti-Catholic, anti-black, and anti-Semitic groups were everywhere. And what these kids wanted, they wanted no part of this. They didn't want to fight it, although they would if they understood they were Jewish. They wanted to be them. They wanted to be what they saw in the movies. And the movies were all about these wasps in movies generally produced by Jews. And that whole Hollywood creation of Andy Hardy and Carvel and everything sweetness and light and pure America was the concoction of Jewish boys in the streets of New York who were the writers on these things. And it was all an invention to be products of an America that never really existed except as a myth, as part of advertising, as part of early magazines. And this myth was so powerful that from the early 20th century on, it's how we saw ourselves, even if we weren't that way. One of the great illustrators, I'm getting way off the subject, but one of the great magazine illustrators, long before Norman Rockwell, was a guy named J.C. Leyendecker, who did over and over again these wonderful post covers and other magazine covers of happy families and lovers and sailing in boats. And he made so much money out of that he could buy a house in Long Island, and he and his male lover lived there for many, many years. This is how gay men made a living. This is how everybody made a living. You knew what it took to be one of them. And it wasn't hypocrisy, it was a devout dream. You believed in the themness of it. And that was the America that I believed in. Next question.
See how easy it is to interview Jules? It's, the next question would be, when did you stop believing it? Sometime,
I still believe in it. I don't believe in America, but I no longer believe in America because too much has happened to make me, and also I'm too old. So I've entered the old fogey period where I still believe in the dreams that I had. I don't believe in the country that I thought I lived in once that could fulfill these dreams. And so instead of doing political cartoons for no purpose at all, because I don't think our politics can measurably get better. What do you think, Victor? When I was of a certain age, meaning in my 80s, and I could no longer breathe in New York City on the Upper West Side, and I could no longer hear in New York City, and I could no longer walk the streets with or without my dog because I didn't have the breath and I moved out to Southampton, where I was teaching a class once a week, and I made that my home, and I thought, what kind of work can I do out here? And I started fooling around because I couldn't write plays anymore, which I loved, but because I couldn't hear the plays I wrote. I mean, it's awful. I'm a Tony voter, and I don't dare go to the theater free because I'm not going to hear a goddamn thing. And I mean, this is what drove me out of the city. And the deficits that I was constantly aware of drove me into a place where I could reinvent myself where these deficits didn't exist. And I could find a line of work if I scrambled, and I did, that would help me to find what I was at the age of 80, and that turned out to be the graphic novel dealing with a period that was a transition period in American cultural, literary, and film history. That the work of Hammett and Chandler, and I mean, all of the work that happened after World War II, the films we got. We were the most victorious country coming out of the war. We were the least hurt, we were the least harmed, least injured, and the most paranoid. And with all the celebration of in musicals of the middle class that was becoming the first middle class we ever really had on a mass scale. There never was a middle class before. With all of that, there were these movies of They're Coming to Get Us, the creatures from outer space. GIs would come home in these movies. Robert Mitchum discovered that Robert Ryan had stolen his woman because he was a slacker and a war profiteer, and she had no morals at all. There was disillusion and cynicism as soon as the war ended, and this was fascinating to me.
can I roll you back a little bit?
What's that?
Can I roll you back a little bit in time?
What do you mean?
I want to pull you back a little pre-war.
No, but I just want to get.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
this. So it was this period I wanted to go back and recreate in my work, which became Kill My Mother, my first noir graphic novel, which is now part of a trilogy. Go ahead.
We now have the frame, actually, the whole frame. But I wanted to ask you some more about your own coming of age and your...
It was last week.
And your progress through this thing you just described, this wanting to be heroic, wanting to be all-American, and how you created these characters yourself, just like the people you're talking about, who were all in that. And then you went into the Army, and for the first time you actually expressed some of what you felt.
Well, as a nice Jewish boy in the Bronx, I understood, because it was drummed into my head, that what everybody was doing was for my best, even if I hated it. What my parents were doing was for my best, even though I hated it. What my teachers were doing was for my best, even though I hated it. And I subscribed to that seemed to be accurate enough. Nobody, except for certain teachers who truly hated me, but no more than I hated them. But when I went into the Army, the illusion that anybody is doing anything for your best was blown away. And I could see and feel instantly the indifference to my existence of the U.S. military. From the second I got there, I stopped feeling like a person and began feeling like a cipher. And as that cipher, since I was feeling at home repressed enough, I felt for the first time in my life this emerging, burgeoning rage. Because whatever I was angry at as a nice Jewish boy back home, I had no targets for it because I couldn't take it out on my poor suffering parents, but I could take it out on the poor fucking United States Army, who couldn't give a crap about me. And so I had an enemy. And I began to think of myself not as moral, nice Jewish Jules, but as a CIA agent in enemy territory, and having to do whatever I had to do to win my war, which was not with the Koreans, but with the United States Army. So I began to strategize, and I mean, what became part and parcel of the kind of adult that I entered into the civilian world as my 20s began in the Army. The first conscious thought I had when I was discharged is I'm never going to take shit again from anybody. And that's something I never would have thought of before I went in, because I thought that's what you do.
And while he was in the Army, he began a book, his first characteristic Feiffer book, which probably half the people in this audience are too young to have seen.
Well, to try to explain what was going on with myself in regard to authority, in regard to mindless authority, and venal meaning authority, I began to think of some satiric form, some way to express it. And I began to think of this narrative comic book, long narrative cartoon. There was some such at the time. There was a couple of cartoonists, Don Freeman, a few others, who were doing books of drawings, and there were artists I admired like Robert Osborne and New Republic and Fortune. I mean, people who expressed anger and rage and told stories in narrative form. So I devised a story about a 4-year-old kid who gets drafted by the Army by mistake and goes in the Army trying to explain to them he's only 4, but they don't draft men of 4 in the Army, so they know it's all in his head, and none of them see him as 4, they see him as a soldier. And finally he sees himself as a soldier, because if all of these smart people told him that he's wrong, he must be wrong. And so he tries to be one of them. Anyhow, what I understood in this disguised paean of rage is that it can't be a polemic or nobody's going to read it. It can't be a lecture because nobody's going to care. It has to come across as a kind of children's book for grown-ups. It has to be, first of all, entertaining and very funny, and that the satire and the social comment and the politics of it has to come through the back door. It has to be a sleight of hand, a magic act. And so I invented the form that basically I pursue now until this very moment. That it taught me how to be funny and still make a point, how to move a story forward. I mean, it took stops and starts. It took me 2.5 years to write this 40-page book because I was inventing a form as I was doing it. And I remember walking across parade grounds, only thinking of Monroe and what's going on. And I'd say, well, where am I? Not meaning, where am I on this parade ground, but where am I in the story? And over the years, when I don't know where I'm going in a plot, and I still say, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? Because the story, as much as I tell the story, I've discovered over the years, the story tells you what it's doing, what it wants to go. And you have to be honest to this. You can't manipulate a story to where it doesn't want to go. Martha's a writer, knows that. You can't, because you think it should go somewhere, if you try to force it, it's not going to be any good. There has to be a collaboration between you and your story.
Can you expand that a little bit to talk about your first days of The Voice? Because what Jules told me, and is in the book, is that when he first came into the Voice office and showed them his drawings, they hired him immediately and said, you can do whatever you want. And this threw him into an existential
Well, I got a
hole.
lead in January 1953, and nobody would buy my work up until and including the time I went to the Village Voice in October of 1956. I'd sold some stuff to advertising, some crap drawings, and it was just hated every second of it. And, but not anything of my own work. And I had by this time, besides Monroe, written a story called Sick, 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 which was about, though it turned out to be the title of the Voice strip, originally was the title of another narrative about mixed up identities, the conformity in the 1950s. And I'd written a story called Boom about the bomb, and I took these around to publishers. Nobody. They told me how talented, how good, how interesting, and no, they couldn't buy them because they didn't know how to sell them. They weren't marketable. And it became clear that it wasn't marketable, not alone because of the politics, although that might have been an underlying principle, but because I wasn't famous. That if my name was Steig or Steinberg or Thurber, no problem. So I had to figure out how I become James Thurber or Saul Steinberg or William Steig. And every editor who turned me down, saying nice things, saying how talented, they didn't say, well, if you just do this, you can get better, or you could do that. No, they said, love it, we can't sell it. Goodbye. I mean, they took me out to lunch. I was their favorite rejectee. I had lots of free and loving lunches and lots of patronage from, uncles and aunts who were editors, who knew I would make it in 30 or 40 years if I lived that long. But on each of their desks, I found this new newspaper called the Village Voice. And when you're that desperate, you get canny. And I realized that if I could appear in this newspaper with a circulation of 12, that at that time, that they all read, they would think I was famous and they'd buy me. So I went to The Voice, not knowing I had never read The Voice, and until I had to go there. And they loved what I did immediately. Jerry Tolma, who was the editor at the time, not the overall editor, but basically he put out the paper. He flipped when he saw the work that everybody else flipped and rejected, but he flipped and said, "Let me show this to Dan and Ed," Dan Wolfe was the editor, Ed Fancher was the publisher. They flipped. They said, "When can you start?" I mean, there was nothing like this ever happened to me. They offered me so much so quickly that I began to wonder, what's their game?
But no money. They didn't offer him any money.
But that was hardly, I mean, they didn't pay anybody any money, and no money didn't matter to me because I already was not making any money. And once the Voice strip started appearing, within a month or so, the comment it was eliciting from people who stopped me and talked to me about it was not how funny or how satiric or how charming, but how'd you get this into print? Because I was doing stuff that they talked about, that was on their minds. I was doing stuff such as Mort Sloll was doing at the Hungry Eye at the time in San Francisco, such as the Compass Players had begun doing a few months after me in Chicago, that evolved into Second City, and Mike Nichols and Elaine May, and a few years later Lenny Bruce. I mean, there was something in the air at the time. There was my generation of urban-educated liberals understood when I was beginning my life at The Voice that liberals did not have First Amendment rights, that you had to hide what you thought. And if you thought potentially left liberal thoughts, and speak about it among your friends and quietly, but you're not at the office because you could lose your job. It could hurt your future. But I couldn't lose my job because I didn't have one. And I couldn't injure my future because I didn't have one. I had fucked it up, I'd already there wasn't a bridge I hadn't already burned, so I was free to do any goddamn thing I pleased. And out of that freedom, I invented a career, even little knowing, although hoping that I knew where it would go. And where it's gone is to bring me back to doing the kind of comic strip I wanted to do in the first place, an adventure strip.
Very good. From The Voice, when we were talking for the book, you told me that you were constantly being told by your friends that your panels were like plays, correct?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about?
Well, I got in the early years of the cartoon, I got cultivated by the New York coming next generation literary crowd, the Paris Review crowd, George Plimpton and company. And George was a wonderful fellow, and most of the friends I met, and also my first wife, came out of that group. But I would be wonderful people, wonderful writers there, and they would all come around and say, "I love that thing you do, that essay." I said, "No, comic strip." They, no, it's so much more. And I'd say, "No, it's a cartoon, it's a comic strip." But they had to argue with me because, being serious literateurs, they couldn't be impressed with the cartoon. So it had to be an essay. It had to be something else. And finally they settled on, it's a play. What do you do with these little plays? It's wonderful. And I was so impressed with them talking to me about these little plays that I went out and wrote Little Murders, my first real play. And when the play opened and was reviewed by newspapers in New York, it said, "This isn't a play, it's a Feiffer cartoon." Which is how I got validated as a cartoonist finally.
And then we can step right through. I mean, you all know, I suppose, how many different careers Jules has had. It's really one career, but steps along. After Little Murders.
Well, after Little Murders, there was a play called a political play. This was at the time of the heightened Cold War. Of this country and its being all powerful in terms of its aggressive instincts around the world, and using the existence of the Soviet Union to do whatever it damn pleased anywhere else. And when I I was most influenced in my thinking in these regards. There was the Eye of Stone, had a weekly newsletter which essentially, I had, my sister who was a Stalinist, had Marx and Lenin. My Marx and Lenin were Izzy Stone and Murray Kempton, who was then in the New York Post. And they essentially framed the way I looked at things politically. And what's interesting about those years, and there was actually a book review in The Nation that referred to it this last week, that the original people who hated government and attacked government and didn't trust government were the left. And beginning with Stone, who were talking to us about what government was doing and what they were hiding and what they were lying about. And out of that, I built a political posture, which then went into the extracurricular work I did, not just in cartoons, but in plays. And so Little Murders, my first play, which I thought of as a post-assassination, Kennedy assassination play, was about the breakdown of America, the national nervous breakdown we were entering as the culture clashed with all of the things that it couldn't deal with openly and lied about and pretended didn't happen, while all systems of authority were basically caving in on themselves. And a system of random violence had started out, so my random violence used in Little Murders was not just about Kennedy being shot and Ruby shooting Oswald. It was about violence in every step of the way, and including Vietnam. How we were the good guys as we killed thousands of people over there and dropped napalm bombs and all that stuff. And this was the work I was doing and felt I had to do. And And when it was no longer functioning well enough as far as I was concerned in 6 panels, I had to find another form, and I found the theater. And then it led to film, because one thing leads to another. But all of it was simply evolved out of the same desires and the same approaches. And it's just figuring out how to tell my story in ways that are most effective.
We're going to break now and get questions from the audience.
We're coming to the latter part of our conversation portion this evening, so I did want to open it up to you all. I will come around with a mic if you just want to raise your hand if you have a question for Jules. Anybody? Okay. Start in the middle.
Sure.
Martha, this is to you and to Jules. Given that you were trying to grab a hold of 70 years worth of work, what was that process like? How did you go about it?
It's easier on paper than it is live, I can tell you.
I'm seeing that. That's why I'm wondering.
It's huge. It's really huge. Sorry, can you hear me? It's a huge career, but I think what I was trying to say in the beginning was that Jules makes it sound as if it's totally serendipitous and that it was accidental. In fact, there is a very clear thread through his work, and it really was always about your survival and getting out from under the invisible force that was keeping him down. And he has succeeded in doing it in many, many avenues. I mean, different paths that are all closely related. But Jules is as you can see, he's a wonderful raconteur, and his memory is terrific. And when we worked, I mean, he was some of the best interview material I ever had, and consistently so. So, but we divided it up. I mean, it is chronological because it's such a big, big map. Thank you.
Yeah.
Victor's
Hi.
getting the.
Hi, Jules. Victor Navasky. Hi.
Listen to the microphone, Victor.
There's, we're in the presence of this genius talent, and what I'm really interested in today, Jules, is the Committee to Protect Journalists put out a report today which says that political cartoons have a power and cause an emotional reaction that words don't. And we come after the Charlie Hebdo thing where they chose to murder people in a visual language office, and the Penn writers bolted and refused to honor Charlie Hebdo because half of them didn't like what the message was. But the fact is, it was a cartoon that caused this violent emotional reaction, and I'm very interested in what you think is the power of visual language and how it relates to so-called hate speech and First Amendment values. So,
Well, it's a complicated question because you're asking about a power that I've seen work or mostly not work from a Western American radical cartoonist point of view that, unlike the French tradition, I mean, it goes back to the masses in the early 20th century, and their cartoonists, nobody killed the cartoonists, but Art Young, one of the great cartoonists, radical cartoonists of the early 20th century, writing in the masses, the socialist anti-war magazine, which, because it was anti-World War I, its editors, including Art Young, was put on trial for sedition. That's the closest we've come to official repression. But of course, cartoonists in this country, while we're not shot, something more effective is done. We're not published. I mean, basically, the political cartoon has disappeared from the United States, from newspapers. There are I don't know, less than, the number is so shocking, I can't even think. I think it's less than 100 newspapers carry political cartoonists, and I think it's maybe about 50 today. I'm not sure. I was on a panel with Gary Trudeau who had the figures, and it slipped my mind because I found it so shocking. We all have, I mean, these Muslim extremists, these nutcases, find their way of dealing with their faith, which is to kill anybody, including a cartoonist, who disagree with it. And in our area, we're much more sophisticated than that because we know, and have always known, how to keep people silent in all of the industries that are public, whether it's in film or TV, less so in book publishing because you can always find a way to get something published, but editorial cartoons certainly so. Now, in a digital age, I guess it's less hard to do that, but to get stuff really circulated in the remaining newspapers, it's virtually impossible. It's the scurrilous act of these French cartoonists, whose work I didn't know, and the people at Penn who refused to go to a dinner that was honoring them and the others, I'm sure didn't know their work either. But the notion that because you disagree with somebody, or hate somebody, or really violently disagree with somebody, it gives you a license to kill. That's the point here. And it's amazing how that whole thought, that license to kill, is accepted across all borders now. The license to kill one sees in abortion clinics. The license to kill one sees in the immigration struggle. I mean, there is. It's wrong. I hate you. Then you're threatening my values. You're threatening my identity. I'm a patriot. I'm an American, or I'm a real Frenchman, or I'm a real Muslim. Therefore, you must die. That kind of insanity has taken root not just in the nutty Muslim community, but now militia community in this country, in the West and in the Midwest and other parts of the country. It's the sacredness of orthodoxy. Anybody who disagrees with me must be persecuted and perhaps put to death. Now, I've always privately thought that way, but I knew it wasn't part but I understood at an early age it wasn't part of the social contract, and I learned to accept that, perhaps reluctantly.
Hi. I wanted to know, does all comic artists have to know how to draw realistic art?
I'm having trouble understanding what you're saying.
Does all comic artists have to know how to draw realistic art?
Are you a comic artist?
No.
No, if you look at the pages of a New Yorker, there are fewer and fewer artists who can draw at all anymore in that magazine. So it's, they don't have to draw realistic art. They don't have to, what they have to have is a certain personal style that identifies them, and that seems authentic to who and what they are and what they're saying in their work. And some of that may include good drawing, but a lot of them take photographs and copy the photographs, which is something that I really basically disapprove of. I think, I'm for free-form drawing because I like to draw. But there's a lot of bad artists who do some wonderful work.
Jules, can you talk about...
And I was one of them until a couple of years ago.
Can you talk, actually, this is a very good question to bring this up from, but that your own transition from colorless art to what you've been doing as a children's book author, and what you did in all your recent work?
Well, I did, as most of you know, the Phantom Tollbooth, but that was because Norton Juster was my roommate. We were friends, and he was cooking, and he wasn't. And as I've said many times, I wasn't going to eat unless I drew. So, and once that book was done, and I didn't particularly have a great time doing it. I thought, well, and I didn't have kids, and I had no interest in children. And besides which, when I started taking my samples around a few years before Tollbooth, and met the great editor at Harper's, legendary editor Ursula Nordstrom, showing her my samples, and she said, "There's a young man I'd like you to meet." And she took me in to introduce me to Maurice Sendak, and I saw his book, A Hole Is to Dig. I thought, well, I got to find some other line of work, and I was not going to go head to head with Maurice, who was nonpareil, and I slipped into the area I slept into that I got to be, but I had no interest in doing more kids' work, and then I had kids at a rather late age, in my 30s. And once I had kids, I became passionate about kids. I mean, and because particularly when you're in your mid-30s and have children, you notice the things that you might tend to ignore in your 20s. But every move was a miracle, and every change was a miracle, and everything the kids did, all three of my kids did, was astonishing to me, and I began to figure out ideas. And also, with my last one, Julie, I had to tell stories to, and she insisted every night when I put her to bed that she didn't want to hear the Cinderella or Goldilocks crap. She wanted an original. So like Scheherazade, I had to improvise a book for her every night. And Bark George, which is the best-selling of all of my children's book, was a story I told Julie and made up on the spot, improvised. And the book, as published, is essentially word for word that improvisation, which I wrote down as soon as I finished the story, because generally I fell asleep, as she did, and when I woke up, I'd never remember the story. So I wouldn't let myself fall asleep. I staggered into my studio, which was next to her bedroom, scribbled some notes, staggered back to her bedroom, fell asleep in the lower bunk. When I woke up, I didn't remember a thing. and thank God there were those notes.
Well, that is fantastic. Unfortunately, we're out of time for the conversation portion of the evening, but on behalf of the Strand, thank you so much, Jules and Martha, for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming out as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.